the 2020 Women's World Cup in Australia. You were part of the marketing team that was responsible for helping get almost a world record crowd for a women's sporting event. More than 80,000 people showed up to the final at the MCG, which was one of the final, if not the last sporting events before the pandemic really kicked off. Prior to that, there's really no history of women's sports or women's cricket being such a hugely successful spectator sport. If you separated, say, the Australian Open as a dual sport, men's and women's tennis, you could say every year you get 20,000 people at Rod Laver Arena, and that's not an issue. But in terms of a team sport like cricket, having that many people turn out to a tournament final when there hadn't been that history in terms of fan support for women's cricket in Australia or anywhere in the world for that matter. What were some of the new initiatives and the things that you were able to put in place that you're most proud of that allowed that become such a huge success?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think the process parallels what the challenge for the 2024 World Cup is too. I give a lot of credit to Kevin Roberts, right, for the ambition and the vision for what was accomplished with the women's strategy to think bigger, right? And so that was the ambition. And then we worked with Nick Hockley, Teresa, and their team. And I think like just to kind of slow it down and speed it up. It's overwhelming to think about selling out a venue of that size. But if you start to look at like different audience sizes of groups of 5,000 people, different audiences that you want to come there, it doesn't seem as daunting anymore, right? And what is the why that somebody would come? So I think what we did really well, it's really a story of audience segmentation to get the cricket passionates, to get the parents of cricket passionates with daughters that this is a landmark moment to come. Katy Perry was a great leverage play, right? What is her fan base? We learned that from BBL. How do you sell entertainment that happens to have a cricket match sometimes? That's a reason for getting people to come there. And then just a real data-driven strategy, which is exactly, I think, what we're looking to do for the World Cup here, to get people that have never really been to a cricket match a reason to come, right? It felt like a big spectacle. And I think that's really important. It should be bigger than sport. So all of those messages, we might have been running 25 different messages out into the marketplace, but it resonates with different types of people that all give them a reason to buy a ticket. So, you know, that was an incredible achievement. Our team, we had a mix of Aussies on our staff and Americans, Tim Hurst, Brian Gaynor, Brooke Halverson, Katie Foglia, just as a few. And I think that was just kind of an all-in effort to, you know, take the learnings of women's sport, BBL, ticket sales strategy to do it. So I think that's a great parallel, Peter, to what we'll do with the World Cup here. You know, that you've got a grandiose vision, but you slow it down. We call it a disciplined sprint. Interesting, our alter ego on these things is Roger Bannister, the great, you know, sprinter. He was the first person to run a sub 4-minute mile. So I think just kind of changing the culture that you can do it, and we're going to do something that's never been done before. So don't tell me why it won't work. We're convinced and we're kind of obsessed with making it happen. So whether that's the cricket World Cup, we just did that with an MLS game on Thanksgiving here. Colorado Rapids, largest TV audience, a sellout, you know, to be able to do it. It's that same kind of process that you go through, whether it's the Colorado Rapids or the first ever T20 World Cup here in the Americas, right? And that's what we love, and that's the moment that we're almost kind of backtracking and working on.
The 2024 T20 World Cup, you referenced it. And one of the other things you referenced in the last answer about setting the record audience for women's cricket in Australia, the 2020 T20 World Cup final for the women's event in Australia and India, is how do you get new people into the ground? How do you get people to come to their first match, or newcomers first time walking to a cricket ground? And that's an even bigger challenge, arguably, in the USA. In my past experiences going to attend games in Florida, which is probably going to be one of the main venues used for the US hosted matches, the venue in Lauderhill, Florida, when India has played the West Indies there, or if it's a CPL T20 match, 95% of the fans, I would say, are pre-existing cricket fans. They're the huge Indian expat fan base. You see a sea of blue jerseys, and you're never going to have an issue selling them tickets and getting them into the ground. You would find some newcomers, first timers, and like you said, somebody who would be invited by a cricket fan to come on down. You got to see this. You got to be part of this experience, and they would have a good time and they would love it. And I would interview them, and they said, absolutely, I would come back. But I think one of the huge obstacles to making that happen is the time zone for the World Cup. Cricket administrators more than likely are going to want to satisfy the Indian time zone and also the UK time zone. And previous evidence has shown when India has played in the US and Florida, those matches start at 10:30 in the morning. That's not an ideal time for an American sports fan, especially one who's trying to be dragged to their first ever cricket match in their life, a sport that they don't know about. Why are they going to wake up at 10:30 in the morning to get there? And if they play games in Dallas, it could be 9:30 in the morning to try and satisfy the primetime markets in India and the mid to late afternoon market in England. So my question is, how is it going to be possible, or what is the best way that you feel will be successful in order to recruit new fans to come to World Cup match if it's going to be getting up at 8 a.m., 9 a.m. to be at the ground for a 10 o'clock start?
I think just getting all those issues out there and having an open discussion for us, Peter, for a fan development strategy. Two things we know about the U.S. ticket buyer right now. We run a lot of digital ticketing strategies for NBA and NHL teams coming out of, especially this pandemic, different fan behaviors. The two things we've learned, FOMO and bucket list, are the number one and two things that U.S. sports fans are looking for in a ticket buying decision. So FOMO, when we do creative messaging, we want to show a party-like atmosphere, right? Like, it's not about the star player maybe that we would just kind of set it and forget it of a traditional campaign. So the more in those markets that we can show that this is a FOMO experience, and then also a bucket list, this is the first time ever. That's what we learned, even in Australia, people that were familiar with obviously the women's game, but had never been. This is the bucket list game to go to, right? So the more that we can kind of create the bigness of the event, and then I think we want to work with the ICC and the local organizing committee, cricket, West Indies and USA Cricket. I think if you do it right, you reverse engineer the building, right? Like, of what you want the stadium to look like. And we need X percent of people that this is going to be their first ever experience. So what are we going to do to drive them regardless of what those variables are, and allocate that inventory in the proper way? Because I agree with you. I think those past Masters in Florida, it could be anywhere in the world. It didn't have a U.S. feel. So I think part of this is to have a U.S. and America, even CPL like fan engagement strategy that is very welcoming, right? So it feels like a New York, Mets game, an NBA game, all mixed in one. It should feel unique for the players as well to kind of cross-pollinate that in a unique way that makes people feel welcome. Here's the key, though. You've got to have a strategy after the game, after the World Cup, to what's next, what's around the corner. So we think about it as a social engagement strategy. I am going there, I am here, and I was there, and now I'm doing this, right? Like, what's the bridge, the baton, whether it's Major League Cricket, it's another, traveling series. I think that's very important, because this is going to be the bridge, just learning like what we saw with the 94 FIFA match too. Pique curiosity. And for any US cricketers that are listening to this, invite people like me to play cricket. Can't stress it enough. Invite my son, invite me over for the Ashes, that are coming up, because that really matters if we're really going to change the heartbeat and the bloodline of sport in this country.